evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the March rock and roll edition of Local History Guild here at the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Got a little special bit of an announcement. Our Phoebe McGee is running our technical tonight because our usual program technical manager Jocelyn Nunes has had a family emergency, and we all collectively at the museum wish her and her family all the best at this tough time for them. So Jocelyn will be back in April for the next edition of the Local History Guild, which I wanted to throw that in real quick. April 14th, Thursday, April 14th, 6 to 7 p.m. The Local History Guild program will be Understanding Art in New Bedford, History, Sources, and Inspiration. So this is Mary Jean Blasdale talking about her art reference book, Artists in New Bedford, and Ron Fortier, local artist, who has compiled 111 podcasts of local artists for his artist index. So this is going to be a really interesting program. It may even be as interesting as tonight's program. Tonight's program is an extension of our ongoing Lighting the Way. What is it, Cathy? A project. It's a project, and it's a big deal. I mean, it has its own website. They've been doing this since 2018. This project looks at the historic women of the South Coast, unearthing remarkable stories of women's callings that required grit, tenacity, and enduring commitment to their families, careers, and community. So the project coordinator for Lighting the Way is Cathy Saunders. Cathy, it's great to have you here for a Local History Guild in March.
Thank you so much for inviting us, and thank you for that intro, and always pleased to partner with the Local History Guild. So as Mike said, Lighting the Way, Historic Women of the South Coast is a project of New Bedford Whaling Museum. It started out as a community project in 2017 or so, and it is now under the umbrella of the Whaling Museum. At the core of it are profiles of these amazing women that Mike referenced, and we have over 120 women profiled right now. Every month we're adding more, and these profiles are inspiring programs like this. And it has the website that Mike mentioned, and so on there you can see when a profile is added, we always feature her right on the banner there. You can see upcoming programs. When we right after this, we follow up with a showcase of art for young people. So that will be all artworks inspired by these Lighting the Way women. But today I heard the theme of women's work for March AHA, and I invited 3 folks at the museum, docents and staff. I gave them a challenge. I said, I want you to head into the exhibits, and where can you find stories about women's work? Where can you find evidence of the work that women did that we may not be telling in the exhibits, or that may not be the primary focus of the exhibit, but that story is there? And then, what's some different way that we can put a different interpretation, a different lens on some of the objects in our galleries and the galleries as a whole that give us an insight to women's contributions to history. So it was just such a delight to have these 3 come back with their versions, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I have, learning from them and hearing the things that they're passionate about. So the first up is Nancy Gentile, who is one of our wonderful docents here, and I believe head of the docent council at the museum right now. And she's a retired research librarian, and she's been a docent here since 2017. So she's, I believe, going to take us into the Bourne building.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm glad to see you all here tonight. And I'm going to talk about my current favorite topic, and that is some of the whaling wives who chose to travel with their captain husbands. So if you'll bear with me just a moment here, I am going to share my screen. And let's see, 1 and 2, and here we are. Okay, very good. All righty, so why on earth did these women get on board whaling ships? They were certainly not cruise ships. How did they deal with the privation, the tiny living quarters, the scary weather, watching their husbands do this dangerous job? These trips were not little trips. It wasn't like taking a short cruise to Bermuda and back. The voyages lasted anywhere from 2 to 5 years and made their way around the world. Can you folks hear me? Just want to make certain. Oh dear.
Yes.
All
Oh,
set. Sounds good.
We hear you loud
Okay.
and clear, Nancy.
Excellent. Okay. So, and they weren't necessarily going to look great during the voyage. In fact, Martha Brown, a woman from Long Island, says, I know some men on this ship do not want to work. And she says, I'm as lazy as any. It's been 3 weeks since I've washed for want of water, but today have plenty of good soft rain, and I have reveled. This woman also jumped rope on board ship, so she had a good sense of fun. Between 1817 and roughly the early 1900s, there were probably about 300 to 400 women who traveled with their husbands. Maybe something like 25% or 75 to 100 left letters and journals. Some were published, many were not. On the other end, if a woman stayed home, many of the letters she wrote to her husband never got to him. One woman wrote 100 letters. Apparently he received 10 of them, so roughly 10%. You know, so it was rough to be away from each other, and many women and men wanted a continuous relationship. So here we are on the Charles W. Morgan. This is the last living whale ship docked at Mystic Seaport in Connecticut. If any one of you has visited it down in Connecticut, or when it had its visit here in New Bedford, you know how restricted the space is, especially down below. If you look over here where I'm putting my arrow, this is the spot where possibly, if a captain's wife was lucky enough, he would have built her a 6 by 6 foot deck house. And she could have done her reading, her sewing, her napping, taking tea and so forth away from the rest of the crew. Now here we are in our Lagoda room. This is a half-scale model built on the plans of the Morgan. Stepping onto this model ship, I think, really gives a wonderful sense of what it was like to be on one of these ships. And if you haven't been to the museum to do that, I suggest you do it forthwith. There's lots of wonderful old implements around the perimeter of the room, and getting on board the ship really gives you a good idea of what it was like. Again, this is a half-scale model built on the plans of the Charles W. Morgan. Let's just move along here. I want to show you a cross-section of a whale ship. And if you look in this right-hand corner, the large red circle is roughly the captain's stateroom area. And this is where a woman would have slept. This smaller circle to the left is that deck house area I was talking about on board deck. Over here in the front, of course, you have the forecastle where about 24 or 25 men would have been crowded. Here we are in the stateroom of the Charles W. Morgan. You can see this nice, comfy red velvet Victorian sofa, built-in cubbies up here and drawers. This little step area, I believe, leads to the bedroom. I wanted to show you this gimbaled bed. This is kind of an interesting thing. It was built on this white box.
Nancy, I'm just going to
Yes.
interrupt for one minute. There's a gray bar that's showing up across your screen. So occasionally something is cut out. So just tell us what is being covered up if it's important.
Sure, of course.
Thanks.
Yep. And so this is a bed that's had its legs cut off, and it is a gimbaled bed, and it's functioning sort of as a glorified hammock, you know, and it's hopefully going to stay level with the ocean as the ship rocks. And I can show you the real thing here in the Charles W. Morgan bedroom. And if you look carefully, you'll see the white post, the long longitudinal box here, and this bed is meant to swing back and forth. So few women went in the early part of the 19th century. It was pretty risque thing to do. Most women were expected to stay home, mind the farm and the family, you know, take care of the home's expenses and so forth. The women that went were pretty willful. Mary Brewster of Connecticut was a lady that's talked a lot about in the literature. Her parents were so against her going that they erected a stone the day she left her voyage in the local cemetery. And it was inscribed on the day that she left for the voyage as her death date. So it could be tough, you know, crews could be resentful and skeptical about women being on board. The captain was said to have paid extra money back to the owners for their wives' food. So these men were resentful. They thought they were missing out on extra food, I guess. Crews ate things like dried beef and horse, hardtack biscuits, molasses, occasional fruit when they could get it. Wives had chickens and, of course, eggs, goat milk, hog meat when they could get it, sugar, which was considered a delicacy at the time. Here's a deck house. This is kind of a modern thing, but I found it in a thesis by R. Laurel Seaborn. And this is the kind of little house that women would have had on board deck if they were fortunate enough. I'm going to skip through this really quickly. These are some of the typical routes that whalers would have taken. You know, unlike British whale ships, the captain of a whale ship, you know, was expected to be the physician and the surgeon. So he brought a medicine box on board ship, and there were things in it like laudanum, tinctures of opium, purgatives, you know. Women did lots of nursing. And I kind of think this is how they probably earned their keep on board these ships. This is the Bay of Islands off the coast of New Zealand. I mean, who wouldn't want to go there? Many of these women were often dropped off if especially they were very seasick. A lot of whalers took their time and effort to go to places like this to get water, fruit, and vegetables, and so forth. And, you know, besides nursing, besides caring for their children, they did a lot of journaling. Women were kind of expected to do this at that time. They may have been reading passages from the Bible. They would have probably wanted to reflect on it in a journal. I suspect that if we didn't have some women keeping logs of their own journals, we wouldn't know really what went on board these ships from day to day, because the typical logbook of a captain was anything but a long description of what was happening. And some of these women navigated. Some of them, of course, kept their husbands from screaming at the men. There's one woman who said, you know, if I wasn't there, my husband would have beat the men every day. Here we have a gamming chair. Very often, if captains were out in the open ocean and they saw another ship, they boarded the ship and had a gam together. They chewed the fat, you know, and exchanged letters and talked. And if there was another wife on board, a captain's wife could visit it. You know, I've also read that women were not welcome in the galleys, and that was for the most part true. But then I read, you know, that Lucy Smith made 8 pies on a particular week. And that's because there was a little room near the bulkhead in the stern of the ship where women could prepare pies ahead of time. Here we have our first lady that I'd like to chat about. She was Mary Hayden Russell. We don't have a picture of her, but we do have an autograph of her daughter's signature, Mary Ann Jewett. She's the earliest documented wife to go, her mom, Mary Hayden Russell. She set sail in 1817 from Milford Haven, Wales. She was a Nantucket lady. She must have liked it because she went back in 1824 with her son, who had become a boat steerer. And, you know, wonderful things happened on board ship. Um, she said that when they did finally sight a whale for the first time, there was so much shouting and pounding on the decks that she thought the ship was sinking. And she writes to her daughter, watched her son's boat being dragged across the water by a whale, then saw her husband's boat disappear in a thunderstorm and stay out of sight for 4 hours. She wrote to her daughter, Marion, quote, think how anxious I must have been and how happy I was to see your father. He had not a dry thread in his clothing. I thought, so this is the way these sons of the ocean earn their money that is so thoughtlessly spent at home. She also boasted her prowess at nursing men on board, claimed that whatever concoction she chose from the captain's medicine chest seemed to work for her.
Nancy, let me interrupt you there for a moment.
Yeah,
Could you go
sure.
back to that quotation, please, about this is how they earn their money? Could you repeat that, please? That's
Sure,
a
of
very,
course.
very interesting insight. This is a woman saying this at sea in the whale fishery at the beginning of the ascendancy of the whale fishery. Could you repeat that again, please?
Sure, of course. So she writes to her daughter, Marion, quote, think how anxious I must have been and how happy I was to see your father. He had not a dry thread in his clothing. I thought, this is the way these sons of the ocean earn their money that is so thoughtlessly spent at home.
This is the way these sons of the ocean earn their money that is so thoughtlessly spent at home.
It's an interesting quote.
It is a very...
Okay, so we've got Eliza and Captain Tom Williams. This is one of my favorite stories. This will give you an idea of what a typical whaling wife went through at home. So they get married early on. Husband Tom goes off, returns after 2 years to meet his first son, Stancil. Captain stays home for 6 months. Wife gets pregnant again. Husband goes off and comes home 3 years later to meet his second son, Henry, for the first time. So now 5 years have gone by, and Eliza decides, no, you know, at the end of this, I am coming with you next time. So she leaves town in 1858, boards the ship 5 months pregnant, and heads off on a whaling voyage. She has 3 more children on board and survives 2 shipwrecks. She also had a great deal of courage. You know, when a man was badly wounded from an exploded gun, there were strong men on board the ship who couldn't deal with it. She had to hold the man's head so her husband could sew him up. Next, we have
These are
Caroline.
strong women.
Yeah, it's just, I still can't wrap my head around some of these stories. Caroline Mayhew was from Martha's Vineyard. A book I read listed 30 whaling captains from Martha's Vineyard who took their wives with them. So some of these women probably, you know, went around the world, much less go to downtown Boston. They probably never been there. She sailed early on in the 1830s and 40s. She was a doctor's daughter. She was on a ship when smallpox broke out. She refused to be dropped off to the islands. She tended to all the sick. Her husband got sick as well. She did learn to navigate, and she took part in the navigation. She got sick herself. When Caroline recovered, she received oodles of gifts from the crew who say she saved their lives. So she earned her keep. And she went to the Bay of Islands with her husband. They both invested in land as well as whale hunting. You know, the Maori were friendly. There was a mission there. They were building roads and so forth. It was an attractive place for whalers to go. It's mentioned repeatedly, you know, in various journals. Okay, so next slide. Here we have Maria and Captain Antonio Corvello, 1913. So by this time, most ships were mostly all Azorean, Cabo Verde men. Captain Corvello survived a couple of mutinies on board that were pretty ugly. His wife, Maria, traveled with him on a second voyage in 1919 with her daughter in tow, Fleur-Pays, to face the second mutiny. So while this guy was up in the rigging directing a whale hunt, 3 crew members, the cook, the steward, and the helmsman, were attacked. The steward managed to run down below and locked himself into a cabin. The mutineers ran down after him, banging on the door with sledgehammers, trying to get the door open. The captain got wind, rushed down to quell the riot, quote, with boots and fists. The troublemakers got clapped into irons, and delivered to a jail in Barbados. To add to all this, her husband died of the influenza after the end of the voyage in 1919. Captain Benjamin Morrell and Abby Jane Morrell. She was one of the early gals. Her husband was kind of an entrepreneur, an opportunist. He did sealing as well as whaling. He meets this very young distant cousin who's 16. Parents are pretty wary, but they end up getting married. She cries for a week because she wants to come on board her first voyage with her husband. And he relents. He had lost his wife, I believe, to smallpox, although I'm not sure about that, after he had come home from a previous voyage. So it's very likely he wanted her to come because he didn't want to be away from his wife. On board the ship, though, the men develop malaria. He won't stop at a port because he's afraid the men might accuse him of catering to his wife. She turns out to be quite the adventurer. They head to Fiji at one point, and this guy's an opportunist, and so he harvests bêche de mer, which are basically sea worms from the ocean. It was considered kind of an Asian delicacy, and so of course they have to dry them on clotheslines, and they land on Fiji, and the natives are not happy about this. Caroline witnesses at least one battle and watches some cannibalism going on. She braves through it all, writes a book called Captain's Wife. And my last lady is Marion Shaw Smith. By this time, late 19th century, she is expanding the role of a whaling wife. Marion is from South Dartmouth. She goes to school, becomes a teacher of the deaf in Northampton. She marries a guy named Captain Horace Perry. They travel to San Francisco and beyond. They go to Japan and the Arctic. She sails on 10 voyages over 18 long years with her husband. She goes to the store, buys herself a camera, becomes a photographer, and she takes these wonderful pictures. This is one of hers, publishes a book around the turn of the century. This is from the archives of the Whaling Museum. And there are a whole lot more stories where these came from. I took a lot of my info from a book called Petticoat Whalers by Joan Druitt. Thank you very much.
Nancy, I just love this, these stories, and I'm gonna, if anyone has any questions for Nancy, please pop them in the chat right now before we move on. But I just want to ask you, Nancy, what got you inspired to delve into these whaling women? Like, what was your draw in?
Right. So on my first week of work there, I was totally confused about the whale hunt, and I was asking 30 million questions to someone who's become a pal of mine at the museum, a docent who's been there for a while. And he had me read a book called The Whalers, which he said, that'll give you a pretty good idea in a nutshell of what a whale hunt is like. And there was a chapter on the whaling wives, and I just couldn't believe what some of these women did and what they went through. They had to be very courageous and willful, determined. Scary.
Yeah.
Abby Jane Morrell actually, her husband wrote a narrative, but she wrote a book.
Yes.
She wrote and published a book that was a companion volume to that voyage. So the two of those books together way off each other. They're a scholarly conundrum when it comes to analyzing, the Morrell's voyages. So that Abby Jane Morrell is a big deal.
Yeah, Mike, I've read that Abby Jane's book was considered veritable. And some people were a little skeptical about his book because they thought that he sort of, embroidered stories.
And he had to, the idea was to embroider the stories to build the trade and to build his own profile in it.
Cool.
So at that time, that whole Northwest coast sea otter trade, the fur trade, and as you touched on, bêche de mer and other oddball commodities from the East Indies, edible birds' nests and all kinds of weird stuff. Was Americans didn't have anything to trade.
Yeah, great. I'm going to move
They
us
had to go
along.
find stuff to trade. So sea otter pelts were a big thing to trade in China. So Abby Jane's she's an important figure.
Yeah.
I know we could have done the whole evening on this, but we had a couple other stops in our virtual tour. So the next stop is actually inspired by a staff person here, Emily Reinel, and who she also could not be here because of a family issue. But so I am going to take over and share some of her presentation. And I just want to put the caveat, please understand that I am sharing from Emily's expertise. She left me lots of good notes, but we will do sort of a more the high level look at that. But it was so interesting to have her perspective that I really wanted to include it in here. So she used to work at Plymouth Patuxent, which is formerly Plymouth Plantation. And she was a pilgrim there. So what was really fun when I gave her this challenge, she walked through the exhibits and she said, when I walk into Harboring Hope and I look at the old Dartmouth purchase exhibit there, I recognize a lot of those objects from my days as a pilgrim. And so that's what she brings to the table here. So if you're in the museum, you see this exhibit, Harboring Hope, and this piece about the old Dartmouth purchase. And so this is Old Dartmouth being the area around New Bedford, and that this is the purchase of the land from the European settlers who were based in Plymouth at that point, purchasing this land from the Wampanoag. Now, they weren't purchasing it just in cash dollars. It was really about goods. And what's so interesting about these goods is it gives you a real picture of what was valuable at that time. What was valuable both to the settlers that they had these and also valuable to the Wampanoag. These objects, tell us some really important stories about material culture, about the relations between them. And I think also when I look at this list and I look at the objects, and I'll show you a close up in a second, it gives me a real visceral sense of how basic life was, and we think about what we've been through in the pandemic recently and how much we sort of felt things were, we couldn't have immediate access to things in the way that we were used to. And think here how much so many of these objects were reliant to be shipped back from England. And so you couldn't just ring up Amazon, these were very dear objects. And so this was, valuable enough to be trading for land. So in this exhibit, this is a close up down in this area, sort of looking down at some of these objects. So this is where I'm going to invite. I need some participation here. And Phoebe's going to monitor my chat for me, but I want everyone, I know there's a whole group of you on here, to take a look. And are there any objects that you see in here that make you think like, well, I bet a woman used this, how do you think that might have connected with women's work? Any ideas about how women might have used some of these items in here? And if you can, so I'm sort of pretending that we're all sitting in a room together because that is my favorite way to do these kind of programs. And soon we will be doing in-person programs like these. Invite anyone who hasn't. So I'll sort of start with one that I was kind of surprised at when it was really interesting when I did this with Emily, because she walked me up to this exhibit. And I saw this big bucket and she goes, oh, the kettle. And I said, well, yeah, water. And then she started to list off all the different ways that they might have used this kettle, because again, it's one of the few objects that they have. So, obviously it's for bringing water, but, it would be, that water would be used for cooking. It would be used, you would be doing your dishes in that bucket. They also would be using it to carry drinking water. And in this time period, another interesting piece is, for the most part, the English settlers really didn't like water. They often drank ale back in England, partly because the water wasn't always good, but partly because they thought ale was more filling. Partly it also fit into their humoral system about the different, they had sort of the balancing of the humors, and that this was very, this was part of the balancing of that diet. But they'd also use this outside the home. They'd use this for gardening, and in their gardening, while they may have had some food imported, they really were reliant on, all their vegetables. They would be growing herbs for their medicine. So this one bucket, was so essential to so many functions that women did. Phoebe, we got anything from our audience here?
Not yet, but I would encourage anyone who sees another object.
I know some of you out there, so I'm going to encourage you to engage in here. Yeah. So all those pieces. Another, this, the hatchet.
Penny says the hatchet. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the hatchet, again, we sort of may have this traditional idea that, that it's only men who are, using heavy tools. But definitely women would have been using this. Women were tending the fire in the house. So again, think of that huge hearthstone picture of the fire and cooking over it. And so using that, an axe like this to make wood shavings, or they might have also done that with a knife. Though it is true that probably men would have been doing the major chopping of the wood, but that is something that they might have used a small axe in the home like that. Yeah, thanks, Penny. Another piece is that, that you can see here, there's blankets here and those textiles. They, for the most part, were bringing imported textiles. So they may have been doing mending, but they really wouldn't have been making their own cloth at this period. You're talking early 17th century, middle of the 17th century. And again, I think about that Amazon shipment, none of that 3-day primary, they didn't have Amazon Prime to send their stuff. You had to make stuff last. So they got very good at mending.
We love the long over the knee socks.
Oh yes, the long over the knee sock, right. And so again, interesting is that, they may have done some knitting, but really all of that, that industry was advanced enough in Europe that they could be importing a lot of these clothes. And so that their primary focus would have been mending because the industry hadn't developed enough here for a lot of those items. I find kind of fascinating. I'm going to pop on to another part of the exhibit here, and this is the hoe.
Before you move on, Cathy, could we talk about the wampum? That's one more thing that someone would like to, Nancy would like to point out.
Yes, thank you. So in this, this small pot was for cooking, and that is, yes, the wampum in there. And so the wampum, obviously, the English settlers didn't have a lot of value for, but the pot, or, that wouldn't have been valued in women's work, but that was sort of what it was passed on in. But for this cooking, this would have been a major component for her. And she might have had pots of a couple of different sizes. A real common thing that they would have made would be pottage, which would be boiled over the fire. And so it has a kind of grain, sort of often like a, large, when you grind corn, you get a mix that some of the leftover, the sort of harder bits then would be cooked down in that pottage, and then you'd throw other things like meat, comes out a bit like oatmeal. But she also explained that as a pilgrim, she got to cook a duck in a pot like that. And that's the last way I would imagine cooking a duck. I'm going to just share one other quick item before I pass this off. And this is the garden hoe. And so obviously, first thoughts go to the garden and that important role of the garden. But they also, that gardening was really, both genders were working in the fields at this time. This is where there was a place where there wasn't as much of a division of duties. It was really by who was available. But it also was used for the muck heaps. And muck heaps, we might think of as compost piles, but it is not only the food scraps, it's also where you would go to the bathroom. So that would be mixed into your compost too. And so it'd be human and animal manure mixed in. So a really important part of sort of managing your land space. So I know we will be sort of repurposing this in maybe some different ways. And Emily will definitely be back to sort of expand on this and do this again. And I hope you can come back and see her because she has so many wonderful stories with it. But I wanted to give you this taste about what it can look like when you kind of ask a different question when you look at an exhibit, and maybe think about some things that you haven't thought about before, and follow that curiosity and exploration. So, but I'll take any final questions and I'll do my best to answer them if there are any. Phoebe?
I missed one question from the chat, but it is, speaking of coming to visit and experience the exhibit itself, it's hard to tell how big the skin is, but Suzanne was asking if it is a black bear skin based on size. Is that a bear skin?
Mike, do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, I do. I put that exhibit together. The whole, if we had put the entire, it's a moose hide. If we had put the entire exhibit together, it would be a gigantic pile of stuff. This was these were the materials that the people of the Plymouth plantation paid to the Wampanoag for the old Dartmouth region. And that was several of these moose hides. Moose hide were very, very valuable they made shirts out of them and moccasins out of moose hide. In addition to the rest of the material, I wanted to do the whole thing. I wanted to put the whole pile up. You have any idea how hard it is to get moose hides? It was all I could do for one moose hide. And that copper kettle was something like, I don't know, 650 or 800 bucks. I mean, it was a very, very expensive.
Even today.
Well, yeah, especially today. So,
well, yeah,
that's what that is. It's a moose hide, and it was, this one this is the replacement. We actually own this one. We bought this one. It took me months to track down one they had to borrow from the University of Minnesota, from the Natural History Museum in the University of Minnesota. They had a moose hide. You guys might remember it, the ones with the hoofs. It had hoofs hanging down. Do you remember that one? That was maybe that was before your time, but it had
before my time. Yeah.
That was the one we borrowed from the Bell Museum at the University of Minnesota.
Yeah.
We've since sent that one back, and we bought this one.
Great. Thank you all. So I'm going to now turn this over to Carol. Carol is another docent at the Whaling Museum, and she has what have you been, 5 years now, Carol, I think? Or has it been more?
6.
6, I think.
Such an old
And
timer.
Carol's a retired school teacher, and she has been a frequent docent interpreter for Lighting the Way Women stories. And so I'm going to turn over to her. And
Okay.
would you like me to start sharing your slides?
No, not right away. We'll
Okay,
talk
great.
about
Let me know when.
Yeah, okay. My talk tonight is 3 parts, really. When we were first talking about doing this, is first of all to talk about what's happening in New Bedford around the time of the decline of whaling and the rise of the textile industry, to kind of promote the energy and enterprise room that we have that we don't often use, a little bit less with the kids anyways, and what women are in this part of history that have been overlooked in a way. So most of you, I'm sure people here know about the decline of whaling. It reached its peak in 1857. It had, close to, and I'm rounding numbers, 400 vessels, 10,000 men, but it is actually going into a decline. There are several things that are going to happen. Everybody knows the story generally about petroleum coming, and that's so we don't need whale oil anymore. People know about the Civil War, where ships were actually sunk by the Confederate Army, where we did a stone fleet, where we put old whaling ships down to blockade the southern ports filled with stone and sunk them there. The Arctic disaster, where many ships were lost, about 35, a little less. And people didn't need baleen anymore, and certainly didn't need to have the whale oil to light their cities and their homes anymore. So as that's declining, the whaling men were looking for other places to invest. They know what's happening in Fall River, who had started to have textiles because they had water power. We now in New Bedford have coal that we can use to drive steam engines. And so actually the first mill in New Bedford, the Wamsutta mill, was built before even it becomes in 1846. Eventually there's 6 Wamsutta mills, but it's starting. So at the same time whaling is declining, you have industrial textiles growing. And they have a peak about 1920. There are 70 textile mills in New Bedford. And there are at one point 41,000 workers involved in the textile mills. And New Bedford had the highest number of women workers during this period and during World War I. 97% of the people working in these mills are immigrants, which is a huge change and shift for New Bedford. And about a third or over the population of New Bedford are. So now, Cathy, we'll do slide 1 to promote our energy and enterprise room. Is a graphic portrayal. When you see it, there you go. When you go to visit that room, this is a great graph. If you just want to look about what's happening in New Bedford, you have the brown peak of the whaling industry peaking and sliding down. You have at the very bottom, there's kind of a greenish, hard to see, rise of textiles and down. And then you see the population shift. From the beginning, those red bars show the population changing in New Bedford. Second slide, please. Then we have an artistic impression of that same graph information. And you have that quote, "The stacks of great mills have replaced in the skyline the mast of ships." So you have the farmland that used to be the north end, and you can see people, the factory being built, probably like the Wamsutta mill. You see smoke stacks there clearly. So all of that's going on. Okay, so who's coming to work in these mills? Slide 3. I started with a personal story, my grandparents, but their story is like so many other people. We have my grandmother on the bottom there, Ellen Fowler, coming in 1903. She's about 15 or 16 years old, and she comes with her family. Her father comes and works in the mill. She goes right to the mill. She's a weaver in one of the mills, and her father's a loom fixer. And then my grandfather above there, Helmuth Euberger's from Germany, and he comes in 1892 before her. And he's only like 6 or 7 years old. He doesn't go to school. He works in the factory almost right away. All his family, his sisters and everything, they all worked in the cotton factories. And the other thing that you have to always be amazed at, I am anyway, none of them went through high school. None of them went to be, most of them sometimes not beyond 6th grade, or some of the girls not even beyond 4th grade. And so that's going on at the same time. And this family, they had 10 children, 5 boys and 5 girls, and they pulled the boys out. The first 4 boys are pulled out to work in the mills, and they never got to go to high school. So, and the funny story, the family myth is when grandma would get, because she would get a little miffed having 10 children, of course, and they were very poor. And she would tell him, well, at least my family paid their own passage, because grandpa's family was paid by the textile industries. They paid the family to come and work in the mills. So that was her little one-upmanship. Next slide. We're going to talk about the conditions in the mills. And the conditions, and this woman is going to be part of that story. You know that they worked 10 to 12 hours or more. You know that children were working in the mills. There were no child labor laws. You know that it was hot and humid and filled with cotton dust and cotton flakes, and people got asthma and all sorts of breathing problems, brown lung disease. The wages were low. There were no safety laws. There's nobody saying, you know, this is too dangerous here. So this is one of our favorite ladies, is Marie Equi. And Marie Equi was born in New Bedford to a typical Italian Irish family. They had 11 children. 3 died of diphtheria when they were young. Her father was involved in the factories and was a union activist, I would call it. And Marie herself was pulled out of high school to support the family. When she, a little older, she got to be about 15, 16 years old, and she's pulled out to work. And she goes to work in the factories for 2 years, and she has had enough. It is not what she wants. She ends up going to Oregon. She has a rich friend. Off she goes to Oregon and lives there and becomes a doctor. In those days, you didn't have to have a high school degree or anything else. You could take a test, and she graduates from medical school out there when she's one of the very few women to do that. The really interesting part about Marie is that because of her background here in New Bedford, she becomes very involved in helping workers' rights. She's a big proponent of birth control. She's a huge proponent of free medical help, which she practices herself for people who are not able to pay. There's a book about her that if you wanted to read more about this woman, the title of the book is Prejudice. Let's see how get it exactly right. Here it is. A Radical Politics and Outlaw Passion, which she lived an openly gay life. She had what they called a Boston marriage. Boston marriages were wealthy women who lived together and lived openly gay. At one point, she's charged with sedition. She's against the war. She does peacekeeping, wants not to have that happen. And they put her in jail in San Quentin. She's there for 10 months. She's the only woman, political woman. They all feel that probably was her lifestyle that people didn't like, but she's supported by all the firemen and policemen and all the people in the city that she has helped over the years with her doctoring. She's what you call a radical woman, but you read that book and you just fall in love with Marie. Next one. Now this woman takes an opposite path, a different path. This is Alberta Simmons Brownell, and she is born in New Bedford, and she's born about 10 years after Marie. She's born in 1882. Her mother dies when they're fairly young, and she ended up going to Fall River to live, but they obviously had money because she goes to college, and she goes to Wellesley College, and she studies social, industrial, and economic studies. And she graduates in 1906 and says, you know what? I'm going to go and get a job in the factory. I want to live the life, have the life of a woman worker in the textile industry. And that's exactly what she does. And she starts to write for magazines because she has connections, and she's able to write stories about the conditions in those mills for women. And so she influences a lot of people to understand that it's, not some pleasant thing going on in those mills. Interestingly enough, she comes back to New Bedford and keeps going in and visiting the mills and trying to do some undercover journalism. And she actually meets the president of the Bugler Mill, and they fall in love, and she marries the owner of the mill. And they go to the South at one point because, mills were going down to the southern states, and she's with her husband, and she has 4 children under 8 years of age, but she dies at 36 of breast cancer, which is another indication that women in those days didn't have preventative care for breast cancer or anything like that. One other thing is when she got married, the second-handers and the loom fixers bought them a 72-piece of sterling silver settings, which is pretty nice. Next slide. We also have coming at this time, remember, we have the Eastern Europeans coming, you have the Portuguese and other people coming from, and your Azorian and Cape Verdean. Now, we did the Whitman Mills here because that's one of the largest mills that was built in New Bedford a little later on. And the owner didn't put the machinery, the engine was in a separate building. There were many separate buildings for the Whitman Mills. This shows you here the women wore skirts when they were doing the spinning, which is not safe, a bit dangerous, right? It took 6 acres, and if you know New Bedford at all, it became, and it still is, a housing of some kind with apartments. It was the Mars department store. And a lot of people that I've talked to, they go, "Oh, Mars, we know Mars." That part. Okay, next one shows another mill picture. This is the Wamsutta Mill. I put this one in because growing up here, I mean, that's what I always heard. You had to buy sheets from Wamsutta Mill. They were the best sheets in the world. You see there, and when you look closely, there are some young people in this picture working in those mills. Next. And this is the Hathaway Mill, which is where my grandfather worked. And the mix of people there, the Hathaway Mill was also well known for the cotton and things. Go ahead. Let's try to get going. Now, one of my favorite ladies, she's going to be part of, at some point, let me get it right here. Nora Oet Dupre. I love her picture there. She looks, I don't know, could wear that outfit today. And of course, it shows in the background the 3-deckers that we have in New Bedford. The 3-decker buildings are everywhere in New Bedford because of all these people coming in here. And Nora goes to work, of course, and doesn't finish school. Her family is from Canada, French Canadian. She's pulled from school to work, so no high school for her either. But she has this great opportunity. At 22 years old, there is a scholarship in a summer school for women working in industry. And she goes for that summer school to Bryn Mawr. And that opens all these doors for her. She becomes somebody who studies, who finds every opportunity she can to keep learning as she's working in the mill at the same time. She joins the union. She feels that will help make a difference to women. She becomes a shop steward. She marries. She runs for Congress on the Socialist Party, but she gets about 2% of the vote, but she doesn't care. She moves ahead and gets leadership. And then she becomes an engineer. She studies. She passes all the tests. She becomes a full-time engineer at the Acushnet process for the rest of her life. From that one opportunity she got to go to summer school.
Carol, you said she went to Bryn Mawr?
Yes, for summer school.
In Philadelphia?
Yes, they sent her, and it was Bryn Mawr, and it was for a summer program for women working in industry.
That's extraordinary, isn't it?
It is extraordinary. I thought her whole story is extraordinary. Being an engineer and being an engineer in a men's field in those days was really an accomplishment. And then, of course, what happens in New Bedford is we have the 1928 strike, which changes a lot of things for a lot of people. The mill owners meet and they decide to have a 10% pay cut. they all joined together except for one mill. But anyway, the workers for the first time all try to join together. There are unskilled workers, skilled workers. They all have different unions and different guilds. It's almost the guild system, but they unite at one point and they walk out of the factories. And the average worker at that time is making about $1,000 a year. The minimum wage at that time should be about $2,000. So a 10% pay cut would be devastating to most of them. At first in the strike, the New Bedford papers and stuff back the workers. But as things go on, it always happens. The mill owners come back with an offer of, well, we'll do 5%, and some want to take it and some don't. And the union becomes more fractured and breaks up. Some of them have the goal of, we don't want any pay cut, we want a pay raise. They want no child labor, they want equal pay for women. But anyways, the next slide shows, I just like this, I like the picture. Pickett, the ladies garment worker. This one shows what starts to happen. There's an arrest that starts to take place. The New Bedford police started to arrest people. Not their favorite thing to do because some of these are their neighbors, and the mayor calls in the National Guard, and things get a lot more serious and a lot more people are arrested. And they have a picture of the National Guard and the workers. So things start to fall apart, and the workers do go back in at this point. Next slide, though, we have a woman, Ilia Menendez. She was born in 1910, 2004. She went to work at 14. She was a bobbin worker. And she was the primary breadwinner for her family because her father got very ill and could not do any working. Her family came, she did too, from Portugal. She came at 2 years old and worked and had very little schooling. At 18, at the strike, she said, oh, here's my calling. She really felt that this was an important action for her to take. She made sure all the Portuguese workers understood what was going on. Many of them were the unskilled laborers, and she wanted to make sure they understood and stayed united. She talked throughout the country. She becomes part of the International Ladies Garment Workers. She believed that you really should only have an 8-hour day, that you should only have to work 5 days a week, but those at the time were radical beliefs. So she is one of the people who is arrested. And she spent some time on Rikers Island going to be deported. People rally around, try to get them to not do it, but a radical woman is not well thought of. They do not let her go back to Portugal because you have been arrested and you can't become a citizen here. She loses that right. So but the thing is, they send her to Poland, probably thinking there. And she goes to Poland. She's married. The little bit we know is she started a Portuguese radio station in Warsaw. So she continues to be an active woman the rest of her life, even though she's not allowed to go back to her home country or to New Bedford, which is actually, that would be more of her home country.
Carol, we have a question. Do we have any idea what she's holding there?
No. But I'm thinking that this would be my interpretation and my imagination. There's a list of all the workers signing who she's going to help through the strike. I do not know. I love the outfit too, but I do not know. We don't have all that, we have some information. You look up all these things, you kind of get dead ended. Then other pictures, go ahead, Kathy. There are some pictures for our energy enterprise room. So if you come to visit, this particular section shows all the different industries that are in New Bedford, because it's not just textiles. New Bedford had many other industries. Go ahead, trying to watch the time. Yeah. There's another picture of that room. Go ahead. With the big clock. This picture here, I like this part because it shows about New Bedford has the coal and the steam, so they're able to build all these textile industries. And let me do my last woman real quick because she can be our favorites.
Oh, can we, we have a comment, Paulina Aruda, who I think actually is one of the, Paulina gave us, I believe, Elia Menendez's name. So one of the things that we do is we crowdsource names from the community and say, who should we do a profile about? And Paulina, I believe, suggested Eulalia, she adds,
I knew she was considered a communist. I was trying to go quick, but most of the labor workers at that time were considered communist. I mean, that was, but they're socialist, and it was an easy target to do. Yeah.
yeah, so just because I'm not, yeah, so that was, right, I mean, so the politics were very complicated. Yeah, and again, I
They
just
still
want to
are a
shout
little
out
bit.
to
And the
Paulina
International
for,
Ladies Garment Worker, which I had acquaintances with my labor work, were often called communists, absolutely. But let me do the last lady, because it's the same thing. We do not have a picture of her. I actually called the Labor Center over at UMass, and they don't either. I was like, eh. But she was a stitcher, and she was also pulled out of school, 6th grade. She was pulled out. She continues to be a seamstress in New Bedford for quite a while. And we know we have all those little garment shops in New Bedford. Like she worked for a while for Kay Windsor, which growing up, I knew about Kay Windsor clothing, etc. And she believed workers have to stay together and we're gonna fix this life and we're gonna make things better. She's a shop steward. She's the International Lady Garments Worker. She believes that you should have a minimum wage, familiar argument, and clean restrooms. And then her quote was, do your job, and fight like hell against low pay and lousy working conditions. She's a single mom, and she does all of this and becomes a community activist. The best part of her is that she becomes on board with a New Bedford organization, Anti-Poverty. She actually she helps with that and goes to Congress and testifies before a poverty hearing. She starts in New Bedford, the community help centers, and one's named after her. She's on the Mass Council, she was, of senior citizens for affordable care for seniors. She's a big member of the Democratic Party. And she was an advisor and a member of the Labor Center at UMass Dartmouth, you know, the Arnold Dubin Labor Education Center. She started a course there about how to become a leader. She interviewed, and they have an oral history there of all the workers she knew and their experience during the strikes in New Bedford. And they actually have a Doris Badaracci on the Line Award, which they still give out every year at UMass Labor Center. So what I say about all this, when you study the women, these are all women who were mostly pulled from school, had no formal education, but became a doctor, became an engineer, union organizers, leaders in their community, and some were deported, and it was hard life for everybody, but they're the successes. And then I'm standing here because I had grandparents who came over and worked in the textile mill. So there you go.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So I hope this piques everybody's curiosity and encourages you to ask some questions about women's work and what are the stories that we haven't been hearing and need to be told. And just want to invite you to keep engaging in this conversation in your daily lives and with us. Mike, do you have any final thoughts as our local History Guild host that you?
Well, history is society, and it's all of society. And you know, if you look from the top down, very often one can get a sense of a skewed history. However, when, as Carol just demonstrated, and as Lighting the Way demonstrates, and as you know, a whole host of other kinds of history demonstrate, local history, in particular local history, by the way, there are just stories of people in society, and you don't have to scratch the surface very hard to realize that, you know, women went whaling, black guys went whaling, Portuguese guys went whaling, white guys from upstate New York went whaling, German immigrants and Polish immigrants, you know, came and worked in the mills, and these built our community. And the fact is that it's simply telling those stories is key. But to this group, to this local history guild, I must say this. In order for museums to tell stories, we need stuff, we need objects. Museums rely on exhibition, on objects that speak loudly, like a sampler, you know, a sampler. You know, some 12-year-old, 10-year-old girl. We just acquired a sampler from a girl who died the year the sampler was made. She was 12 years old and she died that year. There's some stories there, and there are stories that run through all of our objects, our artifacts, our human condition, our society. And so that's what the local history guild is about. That's what the Lighting the Way is about. That's what the New Bedford Historical Society is about.
That's what the Common Ground Community Mosaic Project is about, telling your
Exactly.
story. So yeah, we want to hear your
stuff. We need stuff.
stories and
lots of
stuff. We want your stories and stuff.
stuff. Thanks, Cathy.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Carol, and thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Emily. And thank you, Phoebe, for being our tech help tonight, and Mike and the Local History Guild and this great community, monthly community that we get to be a part of. And this has just been an absolute pleasure. And hope you'll tune in next month for Local History Guild. And please check out the Lighting the Way website, www.historicwomensouthcoast.org. And have a wonderful rest of your night, and happy Women's History Month and happy Women's Work.
Absolutely.
AHA.
Thank
Good
you.
night.